Yeah, just yell at me when you need me to move. Yeah.
So just start that. Please go right there. Yes, all the way down. Has to be the most all the way through in that road.
Sure, yeah.
right in this row, just fill in all the way down, please. Is it just you? Yeah. Right here. That's good. Whatever. Guys, I'm going to ask you to fill in the front before. Thank you. Hey.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to this judiciary hearing. We have multiple member statements today, so without objection, I'll introduce my longer statement into the hearing record. Today's hearing is about competency, corruption, and cover-up within the Biden administration. Simply put, the last administration was rudderless. From one crisis to another, the Biden administration failed and faltered. The partisan media did their best to cover up those failures. Having discussed these issues with my colleagues, Senator Cornyn and Schmidt, who requested to lead this hearing, all of us agreed that this committee must discuss this important matter. An important part of this discussion involves the last administration's weaponization of law enforcement against Trump and his associates, which was done to try and win an election. That, too, they tried to cover up. Since I became chairman of this committee, my investigative work has exposed how weaponization was done. Look at the FBI's Arctic Frost investigation, which ultimately became one of Jack Smith's cases against President Trump, based upon records that I've made public. The case's origin was anti-Trump FBI agent Theo and his merry band of artisans and partisans. The records indicate that the opening of Arctic Frost was an intentionally designed vehicle by which the Biden administration would ultimately prosecute their primary political opponent, President Trump. Then I made emails public relating to the Biden administration's political investigation into Peter Navarro, Theo, and his other anti-Trump agent, Walter Giardina, were also involved in that case. Whistleblowers have told me that Special Agent Giardina openly stated his desire to investigate Trump, even if it meant false predication. Whistleblowers have also told me that Jack Smith's deputy, J.P. Cooney, wanted to open more cases on Trump. He allegedly justified using compulsory process to obtain more information merely based upon partisan news outlets. And guess who was also allegedly involved in those communications? Well, that's the same person, Special Agent Walter Giardina. All of this is more evidence of law enforcement weaponization that would have never been the light of day, but for whistleblowers. I'll have more to say about this matter later today in another forum. Then we have the Biden FBI's anti-Catholic Richmond memo. That memo used the shoddy research of the radical Southern Poverty Law Center to accuse traditional Catholics of being violent extremists. Based on the records that I released the other week, there wasn't just one FBI document that used biased anti-Catholic sources, but over a dozen. And more FBI field officers were involved than we'd been led to believe. It wasn't just the Biden and Ray FBI that failed the people. Recently, I released records showing that the Biden Health and Human Services also failed to address the backlog of over 65,000 reports expressing concern for unaccompanied children. This included 7,346 reports related to trafficking. 36 cases have been accepted by U.S. attorneys for prosecution, with 11 arrests and 3 convictions so far. The Biden administration had a responsibility to do right by the American people. By any metric, they failed. The question is, what did the president actually know or even understand, and who was actually running the government? But regardless, the buck stops with the president, and President Biden will have to answer to history for what's happened the last 4 years. Now I'm going to turn over the podium to, opportunity to speak to Ranking Member Durbin for his opening remarks, and after that, Senator Cornyn is going to take the chair, and Senator Cornyn and Chairman Schmitt are going to lead the rest of the hearing. Proceed, Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley. This committee has oversight responsibility over the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Homeland Security. We have a constitutional duty to hold these agencies accountable with public hearings. By this date in my first year as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, we had already held 2 major oversight hearings with Biden administration agency heads, including one with the FBI Director Wray on domestic terrorism threats. So far this year, the Republican majority in this committee has not held a single oversight hearing, despite numerous critical challenges facing the nation that are under our jurisdiction. In the last week alone, several events have demanded this committee's immediate attention. The horrific assassination in Minnesota, the treatment of our colleague Senator Padilla by federal agents in Los Angeles, and President Trump's unprecedented deployment of the U.S. military in Los Angeles. We should hear without delay from Attorney General Bondi and FBI Director Patel about what they are doing to address the unacceptable political violence in our country, including threats to Article III judges and justices, as well as members of Congress. And we need to hear from the Homeland Security Secretary Noem about the treatment of our colleague, Senator Padilla, and this administration's mass deportation campaign against immigrants. But instead of exercising this constitutional oversight duty, my Republican colleagues are holding this hearing, apparently armchair diagnosing former President Biden is more important than the issues of grave concern which I have mentioned. To take a few examples of the issues this committee should be addressing, the Trump administration has removed dozens of senior career prosecutors and FBI officials with decades of national security expertise, leaving our nation more vulnerable to terrorism and other national security threats. This should be explained to this committee. The Justice Department has diverted hundreds of law enforcement agents away from combating cartels, drug trafficking, and gun violence to participate in President Trump's mass deportation campaign. This should be addressed in an open hearing of this committee. The Justice Department is also turning a blind eye to corruption. The administration has gutted the Department of Justice's public integrity session, which oversees political corruption, just as the president's shameful crypto scheme unfolds. And the administration has removed Department of Justice career ethics officials and shut down the office charged with investigating misconduct by DOJ attorneys. With these internal checks gone and this committee asleep at the wheel, it's no surprise that Attorney General Bondi signed off on President Trump to accept Qatar's gift of a $400 million luxury airliner, despite the fact that the Attorney General was previously a registered foreign agent for the Qatari government. We are still waiting for her official finding on this gift transfer. And it's no surprise that Department of Justice official Emil Bove tried to strike a corrupt bargain with New York Mayor Eric Adams, dropping public corruption charges in exchange for the mayor's cooperation with Trump agenda mass deportations. When it comes to these historic, compelling issues, the GOP majority tells America to move along. Nothing to see here. Let's revisit this administration of a previous president in this hearing. Let's revisit a 20-year-old precedent on the use of an auto pen. And I know my Republican colleagues are eager to discuss President Biden's pardons. But why are they ignoring the actual pardon crisis that's taking place right now? President Trump's pay-to-play scheme. Last month, President Trump pardoned Paul Walzak, who pleaded guilty in 2024 to withholding over $7 million of taxes from his employees' paychecks and failing to pay them to the Internal Revenue Service. What warranted Mr. Walzak's swift pardon by President Trump? His pardon application explicitly cited millions of dollars his mother raised for President Trump's campaigns and other efforts to support the president. But that was not enough. It was 3 weeks after Mr. Walzak's mother attended a $1 million a person Trump fundraiser in April of this year that Mr. Walzak was miraculously receiving his pardon. And now he no longer must pay $4.4 million to the taxpayers of this country. That's one example of the many pardons granted to President Trump's wealthy donors and political supporters. Of course, these pay-to-play pardons are in addition to more than 1,500 January 6 rioters who received blanket pardon from President Trump, including 169 who violently assaulted law enforcement officials. And we're going to make a question of cognitive ability. I think we should consider what happened in Alberta, Canada, just this week, where President Trump was at a press conference with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and said the following: "You all know the great PM of the UK, and we just signed a document." President Trump continued, "We just signed it, so we have our trade agreement with the EU. Britain has not been a party to the EU for 5 years, but President Trump made a statement which clearly was wrong." Now I'd like you to see a short video that includes some other examples of cognitive ability.
Don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as
I
president?
don't know that windmills are driving the whales crazy, obviously. I have concepts of a plan. They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the... I know about magnets is this. Give me a glass of water. Let me drop it on the magnets. That's the end of the magnet. The kidney has a very special place in the heart. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? This is a tough hurricane, one of the wettest we've ever seen from the standpoint of water. When you ran out the healthy arms, you ran out of really healthy. They had great arms, but they ran out. It's called sports. It's called baseball in particular. Can't understand a word he's saying. Did you just see Maduro, Venezuela? It's unbelievable. Well, I don't know about it. I mean, obviously, I'm not involved.
He wants to know why the proclamation was signed in the dark.
I don't know when it was signed because I didn't sign it. Other people handled it.
Do any of these statements raise a question of cognitive ability? You be the judge. If my colleagues are truly interested in issues of presidential succession and disability under the 25th Amendment, I would suggest they embark on this constitutional journey with a proposed amendment, not today's political adventure. I yield.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Grassley for convening this hearing and my colleague, Senator Schmitt from Missouri, for co-chairing this with me as we examine the constitutional crisis posed by the cover-up of President Biden's cognitive decline. The U.S. Constitution provides, as we all know, for 3 co-equal branches. Today, we're concerned about the chief executive, the President of the United States. As we know, the chief executive, the head of the executive branch, enforces the laws, appoints high-ranking officials, serves as commander-in-chief of our armed forces, can issue pardons, and can veto and advocate for legislation. But what are we to do when the president is incapable of performing these duties? Last June, the American public saw with their own eyes what many knew to be true, but would not dare to admit publicly. Our sitting commander-in-chief was suffering from severe cognitive decline, as evident by this video, which I will now show.
For what I've been able to do with the with the COVID, excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare, wants to get away with, get rid of the ability of Medicare to for the ability to us to be able to negotiate.
As we now know, there was a conspiracy to hide the president's true condition by his family, by his staff, by the media, and many elected officials. Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, who co-authored a book entitled Original Sin, that book amounted to a mea culpa by the mainstream media, but they summed up the problem when they wrote this. Quote, what the world saw at Joe Biden's one and only 2024 debate was not an anomaly. It was not a cold. It was not someone who was under or over prepared. It was not someone who was just a little tired. It was the natural result of an 81-year-old man whose capabilities had been diminishing for years. Biden, his family, and his team let their self-interest and their fear of another Trump term justify an attempt to put an at times addled old man in the Oval Office for 4 more years. So make no mistake about it, this was a constitutional crisis, bigger than President Biden, bigger than any single election, and one that cannot be absolved by the collective apology of the press and an election where the president's party lost. Current events, such as we are experiencing today in the Middle East, are a prime example of why we need a president with his full cognitive abilities, making important decisions involving war and peace. We should know, but we don't yet know, precisely what should happen when a president is unable to perform his or her constitutional duties. And that's the purpose of today's hearing. There are many unanswered questions from this scandal, questions that the authors of Original Sin failed to address in their book, questions that are foundational to the proper functioning of our government. We will address those here and shine a light on exactly what went on in the White House during the Biden presidency. We simply cannot ignore what transpired because President Biden is no longer in office. With a compromised president, our government's very legitimacy and capacity to function was undermined. The American people paid a price, from President Biden's handling of the border crisis to the disastrous events we saw unfold in Afghanistan. It's absolutely imperative that Congress grapple with these difficult questions, no matter how much our Democratic colleagues would like to simply sweep it under the rug. We need to know who was in charge during the last months of the Biden administration. Was it his wife, his chief of staff, nameless others? None of these people were elected by the American people, nor were they authorized by the Constitution and laws of the United States to carry out the duties of the President of the United States. The 25th Amendment provides a roadmap for succession in instances of presidential incapacity. Section 4 gives the Vice President and a majority of the President's cabinet the authority to challenge the President's ability to carry out the functions of his office subject to a vote in Congress. But in this instance, the Vice President and the cabinet, the very ones authorized by the 25th Amendment to question the President's capacity, They did nothing. Are there penalties when the when the cabinet and the vice president refuse to carry out their duties under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment? Should there be more accountability? The framers of this amendment acknowledge that the execution of that amendment would depend on the good faith of the cabinet and the vice president. But Biden's cabinet and the vice president did not act in good faith. They acted in their political and personal self-interest. This is the great paradox of self-government. Many of the rules, traditions, and institutions that sustain our republic are self-enforcing. The health and legitimacy of our democratic republic rests on the character of the men and women who serve in government. As a government, it is imperative that we have clear contingency plans when emergency strikes. And yes, it is an emergency when we have a sitting president who's unable to discharge the duties of that office. The concerns raised by this incident stretch far beyond the bounds of partisan politics. I will note that few of my Democratic colleagues are here today. Thank you to Senator Welch from Vermont for being here, leaving us with no other option than to take the boycotting of this hearing as an admission of guilt for their role in this crisis. We must not turn away from the search for answers, and it is not an overstatement to say that the future of our country could one day hinge on how we choose to act or not act on this very issue. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this morning as we examine the difficult but necessary questions that must be answered from this monumental scandal. I yield to my colleague from Missouri, Senator Schmitt, who will now co-chair the hearing.
Thank you. I do want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to Chairman Grassley for granting me the privilege of co-chairing this committee with my esteemed colleague, Senator Cornyn. The title of the hearing, Unfit to Serve, captures a sobering and undeniable truth. President Biden was mentally unfit to carry out the responsibilities of the most powerful office in the world. Given his mental incapacity, the American people deserve to know who was running the country the last 4 years. Today, as we seek to answer this question, it is deeply disappointing but not surprising that most Democrats on this committee have chosen to all but boycott the hearing and have failed to call a single witness. They have chosen to ignore this issue like they ignored President Biden's decline. Their absence speaks volumes, an implicit admission that the truth is too inconvenient to face. By refusing to engage in this critical examination, they abdicate their responsibility to the American people. This de facto boycott is not just a refusal to participate, it's a refusal to serve the American people who deserve answers about who is truly leading their government. President Biden's decline did not suddenly begin in June of 2024. It was a persistent and obvious truth that was evident for years to anyone who was willing to see it. This reality did not require special insider knowledge or investigative reporting to uncover. We didn't need Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson to tell us what millions of Americans could freely observe with their own eyes. The truth was glaringly obvious. Anyone who was paying attention could tell that the emperor had no clothes. Nearly a year ago, I took the historic step as the first U.S. Senator to formally call for the invocation of the 25th Amendment against President Biden. I sent letters to every cabinet secretary and the vice president laying out the urgent case. Our nation was effectively without a leader. The absence of a functioning president wasn't an abstract issue. It inflicted severe consequences on our nation, consequences that touched every aspect of American life. On border policy, our nation's borders were handed over to the radical left-wing element of the administration, throwing open our borders to 15 million illegal aliens, an unprecedented immigration crisis that pulled our nation into chaos. On foreign policy, haphazard and reckless decisions placed our warfighters in jeopardy, escalated conflicts around the globe, and led to a catastrophic humiliation on the world stage that claimed the lives of 13 American soldiers, including one Missourian, during the disastrous withdrawal from Kabul. On the economy, rampant inflation drove up the cost of life's essentials, making them unaffordable to countless hardworking families. In the realm of culture, the regime censored free speech, closed down churches, targeted traditional Catholics and parents at school board meetings, and let an unelected class of left-wing radicals degrade, attack, and lie about our history and our heritage. A poisonous anti-Western, anti-American ideology that had once been confined to elite university classrooms suddenly became the official White House policy. All of this was done not in isolation. It was sustained, defended, and covered for by an alliance of elite institutions, from the media to the so-called expert class to big tech to the federal bureaucracy itself. When we speak of collusion among elites, or the so-called deep state, we're accused of being conspiracy theorists. But this was no theory. It was plain and overt, out in the open for everyone to see. For 4 years, we had a president who could barely string together coherent sentences after 6 p.m. Yet, this glaring fact went unreported, undiscussed, and unaddressed. Why? Because the Democrat Party, corporate media, federal bureaucracy, and big tech companies collaborated to conceal the truth from the American people, not out of ignorance, but because it advanced their own interests. In the absence of a functioning president, chaos took hold. An empty vessel occupying the Oval Office becomes a puppet for those surrounding him. Many elected officials, including some in this chamber, have used auto pens, a mechanical device that replicates a signature. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, so long as we are the ones actually making the decisions. But under President Biden, the auto pen became a troubling symbol, a symbol of an absentee president and an executive branch directed by nameless, faceless aides that no one outside of Washington, D.C. had ever heard of and no one ever voted for. It was the auto pen presidency, a government run by committee rather than a leader chosen by the American people. By contrast, love him or hate him, we all know President Trump is in command of his presidency, and he is the one calling the shots. It is plain as day that President Trump is actively making the decisions, whether announced via Truth Social or signature. Under President Biden, that transparency and certainty evaporated. We cannot confidently say that the decisions bearing his signature were the will of the president or his Politburo. That goes doubly for his social media posts, including his decision to drop out of the 2024 presidential election. We did not know if it was his decision or posted on his behalf after a palace coup because President Biden was mentally unfit to serve. The corporate media played an indispensable role in this cover-up, systematically suppressing discussion of President Biden's condition. As we will demonstrate in the video evidence presented today, dissenting voices were silenced, and the truth was buried. It was not a passive oversight. It was deliberate. It was a deliberate campaign to shield a narrative that protected the interests of the most powerful. Even members of this very committee, some of whom served alongside then Senator Biden when he chaired this very committee, defended his mental acuity for years. Now Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson offer a convenient narrative to absolve everyone involved. The media lacked access, the family was overtly protective, the cabinet was incompetent, and Robert Hur said the president was merely a well-meaning man in aviators who liked ice cream. It is the tired, evasive refrain of the politician caught in a lie. Mistakes were made. Yes, mistakes were made, and every participant in the cover-up, from the media to the cabinet, is jointly and severally liable for what may very well be the greatest deception in our nation's history. Even their apologies today are framed in a way that absolve them from responsibility for this crime against the American people. They apologize for having missed the story. They didn't miss anything. They actively chose to ignore or run cover for the people in power. The Biden cabinet rarely met, and some members, like former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, deliberately distance themselves from the president to maintain plausible deniability. Even members of this committee were part of the Great Deception. The Monday after Biden announced he would not seek re-election, one member called the idea of invoking the 25th Amendment outrageous, insisting the debate performance does not reflect who he is or his capacity to govern as President of the United States. Another member repeatedly vouched for Biden's fitness, declaring, Joe Biden is fit, capable, and ready to serve another term. And later, this is a man who is sharp, who is on top of his game, who knows what's going on. Yet another, during the 2020 Democrat presidential primary, alluded to Biden's decline, but quickly retracted his remarks when it became politically expedient. After the debate, yet another member praised Biden's strong delivery of remarks to NATO as evidence of his capacity to lead. The purpose of this hearing is not to interrogate Biden officials or partisan reporters, though they should be held accountable. Instead, our focus is to identify and rectify the systemic weaknesses that allowed this situation to fester unchecked. Our distinguished witnesses, experts in White House transparency, operational procedures, and executive power will assist us in diagnosing these flaws. While the House and Senate pursue fact-finding missions to hold these responsible to account, our mission here is to chart a path forward. We cannot allow another weekend at Biden's presidency with its glaring national security vulnerabilities papered over by an auto pen. The DC establishment might argue that the governance of a shadowy, unelected figures is a legitimate substitution for a functioning president. It is not. The American people cast their vote for a president, not a faceless apparatus. Article 2 of the Constitution vests immense authority in the President of the United States, a single individual. With that extraordinary power comes equally profound responsibility. At the Constitutional Convention, our founding fathers debated giving the President the title of Defender of the Rights of the American People. The security and well-being of the American people and their rights must take precedent over personal ambition. It is often said that power corrupts. I believe that power reveals. Over the past 4 years, this cover-up laid bare a disturbing reality. The left and the corporate media place their pursuit of power above the welfare of your families and your country. They dismissed your observations, urging you to not to trust your own eyes. We have a solemn duty to call this what it is, an abdication of constitutional duty. As was stated in Federalist 51, ambition must check ambition. If a president is mentally unfit to serve, we need a dependable mechanism to, at the very least, ensure that the truth reaches the American people. I look forward to the insights this hearing will yield and from our expert witnesses in the discussion that will follow. The public is counting on us to ensure this never happens again, because we won't always be fortunate enough to have a leader like President Trump who is so unmistakably in command. Senator Welch.
Thank you very much. Senator Cornyn indicated the view of the hearing is that there was a constitutional crisis as a result of the cover-up of President Biden's decline. I believe there is a constitutional crisis. It's the collapse of Congress asserting its Article I authority to make decisions about the well-being of the American people. What has this Senate debated in the months that we've been here, other than nominations? Have we discussed the possible war with Iran? Have we had a serious discussion on the floor about the massive and mounting debt? Have we had any discussion about the abdication of congressional spending authority by the impoundment actions of an administration? Have we had a discussion about climate change that is causing havoc throughout the world? What we've done is gone to the floor and haven't debated. We've gone to the floor and voted on nominations. There's another issue of great concern to me, because I have enormous respect for my colleagues. Each and every one of us who was elected, it's the highest honor of our life. Each and every one of us came here because it is in our bones that we want to try to do something beneficial and make life better for the people we represent. And we have different points of view. But instead of this Congress debating those different points of view about oil exploration, or about clean energy, about a good healthcare system, what we do is turn that debate into personal accusations of motivations, of cover-up, of conspiracy, of bad character, of demeaning folks who disagree with us. So we never get to the discussion about how do we have a healthcare system that works for the people in Texas, the people in Louisiana, and the people in Vermont. We never get to the discussion about, are we going to deny the reality of what we know is true, climate change, and how do we address that in a way that maintains a strong economy and actually builds a strong economy? We get into the accusations that if you disagree with me, you're a left-wing radical. We get into these discussions that if you disagree with me, you're a Marxist. We get into these discussions that fan the perception of the people we all represent, who desire nothing more than be able to take care of the families, live with some security, make a contribution in the communities where they live. That if a person disagrees with you, they are a bad person. We will get nowhere with that approach. Now, so many of the things that happened in the Biden administration, I totally supported, and many of you totally opposed. Those are policy disagreements. He came in with COVID. We got through COVID. We can debate about how we did it, but that was an accomplishment. The American Rescue Plan, we had the biggest jobs creation in the history of the country. The CHIPS and Science Act, acknowledging that we have to have a strong economy and be able to have the best chips here manufactured in the United States. We did that. The Federal Disaster Program improved significantly. And I can go on. And I'll take up something where we didn't do well, and that's immigration. You won that argument. But does it mean that those who disagreed with you along the way were bad people, should be labeled Marxist, should be condemned? The American people ultimately gets to decide. But to the extent that we have a responsibility that we share, Republicans and Democrats, whichever side of the issue you're on, is to debate the issue and not debase the people who are in the debate. That's what I see as the crisis that we're facing in this Congress. Our refusal to engage in the serious discussion about the issues that are having such an impact on the people we represent. And I'm going to tell you what I think is a cover-up. I think this big, beautiful bill done by reconciliation, where by decision of the majority, not a single member of the minority who represent half of the citizens of this country can even be in the room when the terms and the policies are being debated. We are not there. That is what I call a cover-up, because our responsibility to the people we all represent is to debate health care, is to debate our budget, is to debate about the debt that we're going to be leaving future generations. And there is no debate in what is going to be decided in the private back rooms amid discussions, not even of all the Republicans, but of some Republican leaders. That's what's going to have a lasting impact on the people every one of us represents, whether it be in Missouri, Texas, North Carolina, or Louisiana, or Vermont. We can't even do our jobs because we're not allowed to be in the room. So, sure, we can enjoy the pleasure of looking back at the Biden administration and then getting into the weeds about when and where and how the president was acting at any given moment. But, you know, I ask myself before I get into a debate and before I do anything, why am I doing it? And if I do it, does it have the potential to make things better for the people I represent? And if the answer is no, it doesn't have any opportunity to help the folks in Vermont, I just shut up. That's what I do, because it won't help. What we're doing right now won't help. It will not help. And I ask myself, why in the world are we doing it? But we know the answer to that, because the politics that has been embraced in this Congress is the politics of accusation, of demeaning adversaries, of deflecting from engaging in the hard discussion about hard issues and trying to come to some common agreement that's going to be to the mutual benefit of all of the people that we represent. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now introduce the witnesses. First up, from my left to right, John Harrison. John C. Harrison is the James Madison Distinguished Professor and Class of 1941 Research Professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia and the Yale Law School. After graduating from law school, he engaged in the private practice of law, then clerked for Judge Robert Bork on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. From 1983 to 1993, he worked at the U.S. Department of Justice, including as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel. He joined the law faculty at the University of Virginia in 1993. In 2008, he was on leave from the law school to serve as counselor on international law and legal advisor to the United States Department of State. His principal academic fields are structural constitutional law, administrative law, federal courts, and constitutional history. Skipping over the empty seat to Theo Wald. Theo Wald is a visiting fellow for law and technology policy at the Heritage Foundation. Wald is the former Solicitor General of Idaho. Previously, Wald served as the acting assistant attorney general in the Office of Legal Policy at the Department of Justice and deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy under President Donald Trump. Wald clerked at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit for Judge Janice Rogers Brown and the U.S. District Court for the District of Puerto Rico for Judge Jose Fuste. Wald is an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force. Wald holds degrees from Georgetown University, where he studied government and English, and from the University of St. Andrews, where he studied English literature, and a JD from the University of Notre Dame. Mr. Wald and his wife have 5 children and live in Boise, Idaho. Sean Spicer. Mr. Spicer served as the 30th White House press secretary, is the author of 4 best-selling books, and the host of The Sean Spicer Show. Mr. Spicer previously served as communications director and chief strategist of the Republican National Committee and worked for several members of Congress. He currently serves on the board of visitors of the U.S. Naval Academy, holds master's degrees from the U.S. Navy War College, and is in his 26th year of service in the U.S. Navy. Mr. Spicer is a native of Rhode Island and resides in Virginia. It is the tradition of this committee that all witnesses will be sworn in. If you'd please rise, I'll swear you in now. Raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. And now we'll start with you, Mr. Harrison, with your opening statement. Sure, Mike there. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schmitt, Senator Cornyn. The committee has asked me to discuss Congress's power to regulate the process by which the president's signature is affixed to a document other than a bimanual signature, that is to say the use of an auto pen or similar technology. I have 4 points to make. The first is that the Constitution and the laws generally, when they require that the president act by signing a document, do not require that the president manually sign the document. The Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel wrote an opinion on that subject in 2005, which is quite extensive, and I find it persuasive. The concept of signature is signing a document is more general than, like a lot of concepts, more general than its central application. The central application is manual signature, but that's not the only way by which someone can sign a document. Someone can also sign a document by indicating that the person signing the document has decided that that person's signature should be affixed to the document by some process other than manual signature. The second point is that as a general matter, Congress has power to carry into execution the constitutional powers of the other branches of government. The last power that is conferred on Congress by Article 1, Section 8, is the end of what's called the necessary and proper clause, and it provides that Congress shall have power, I'll read the whole clause, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, that's Congress's other powers there in Article 1, Section 8, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. That's the last part. That's the part that's relevant here. It's sometimes called the horizontal necessary and proper clause because it operates horizontally among the three co-equal branches. Congress is the legislature. There are times when one of the other constitutional powers can use support that can be given only by the force of law. And that is something that Congress can do with a horizontal and necessary and proper power. The next thing I'll say is there are some principles, I think, that should govern exercises of the horizontal necessary and proper power. The first is that it operate to support, to assist, to make cause to function better, the power that is being carried into execution, be it that of the president or that of the federal courts. The second is that in supporting the other powers, Congress not seek to exercise powers that are vested elsewhere, like the power to decide cases, like the president's power of pardon. And third, when Congress exercises that power, it should make sure not to put substantial burdens on the exercise of the other powers that it's seeking to support, powers that once again are vested elsewhere than in Congress by the Constitution. I think Congress can regularize the process by which the president's signature is affixed without his manual signature in a way that would be consistent with Congress's horizontal necessary and proper power. In particular, Congress can require that when the president indicates that his signature is to be affixed to a document without manual signature, that that decision by the president be documented and some individual record that the president has made that decision and that be made part of the public record, say by being published in the Federal Register or the weekly compilation of presidential documents. A statute like that would carry the president's power into execution because making sure that the president really has made a decision and that it wasn't made by someone else with the president's auto pen is a way to make sure that the power is properly exercised, that is, by the president. As long as a statute like that is completely neutral, applies the same way to all presidential decisions, it shouldn't raise any problem of Congress trying to control the president's authority. Again, constitutional powers are vested in the other branches and supported by Congress under the horizontal necessary and proper power. And third, a requirement of documentation. Well, the White House does a lot of documents. The requirement of documentation would not place a substantial additional burden on the president and the processes by which the president acts. And I would suggest that if the committee consider legislation along these lines, that it inquire into the paper flow process currently used in the White House so that any statute Congress enacts will make that process work better rather than burdening it, making it not work as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wald.
Senator Cornyn, Senator Schmitt, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning about how the cover-up of President Biden's mental decline endangered America's national security and undermined the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution vests executive power in a single person, the president. At the founding, the president exercised the executive power through only a small group of trusted advisors and personnel. In fact, President Washington had a 4-member cabinet. Today, the president directs a Leviathan executive branch with 15 cabinet departments and at least 4 million full-time executive branch employees. The executive branch proliferation has a single source of democratic legitimacy, that by order of U.S. Constitution's Article 2, the president is both elected by the American people and vested with the executive power, all of it. Traditionally, the president takes positive actions and authenticates those actions through his signature. His signature is required for the most significant actions he may undertake, to sign an executive order, to take any action invested in him by the Constitution, as in granting a pardon, and to take the most important action of all, to sign a bill into law. In all these cases, the president's signature is itself the protection of democratic principle, When the president signs, he communicates his assent and endorsement of the action he takes. The auto pen is a device that signs the president's signature to a document. The oversight project, of which I am a board member, has discovered that the Biden White House deployed an auto pen to affix President Biden's signature to pardons, prison commutations, executive orders, and presidential proclamations. The Oversight Project's research has found that the Biden White House first deployed the auto pen to affix President Biden's signature to a proclamation on day 5 of his administration, and that there were at least 3 different auto pen signatures in use throughout President Biden's tenure in the White House. In June 2022, the Biden White House began deploying the auto pen to sign clemency warrants and executive orders. Auto pen use skyrocketed from there. We found that of the 51 clemency warrants issued during the Biden presidency, over half, 32 in total, were signed with an auto pen. And these include some of the most controversial acts of clemency of the Biden presidency, including death row commutations and the preemptive pardons of members of the Biden family, Dr. Anthony Fauci, General Mark Milley, and more that were issued in the final days of the Biden presidency. We reviewed President Biden's schedule in his publicly available media and were unable to find any record of President Biden's personally approving these actions, such as a statement issued by the president himself to reporters. In addition, we found that the Biden White House used the auto pen to affix President Biden's signature to clemency warrants and executive orders while the president himself was in Washington, D.C. for at least some of that day, and thus was presumably available to sign important executive actions. Finally, we found multiple days where President Biden wet-signed a bill into law, but used an auto pen to issue an executive order or for other important executive actions. The Biden White House's widespread use of an auto pen to affix President Biden's signatures to documents that exercise executive powers belonging solely to the president poses significant constitutional, legal, and practical considerations. Once the president's signature is copied and loaded into the auto pen, the machine can sign documents as the president himself would. To be blunt, by using the auto pen, anyone can sign documents as the president himself. Now, to be clear, I'm not here today to suggest that the auto pen is bad. It's just technology. I'm here today because of questions concerning President Biden's capacity and whether the auto pen was used to usurp presidential power or to conceal the president's decline. As the sitting president's mental acuity declined, potentially to the point of incapacitation, his administration's expansion of the powers of the presidency raises more questions than answers. Any investigation into this matter should focus not only on whether President Biden directed or authorized subordinate staff to take action in certain instances, but whether he had the capacity to do so at all. The 25th Amendment lays out clear procedures for what to do when the president is incapacitated. It was carefully drafted and informed by our nation's history. The Biden administration ignored it all to aggrandize executive power and push the country further in their preferred ideological direction. It is our obligation at this point to get to the bottom of these issues and to ask the important question as to whether or not the auto pen and other devices were used to cover and obscure President Biden's mental decline, undermining our national security and also the Constitution. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning.
Right on time, pretty impressive. Thank you. Mr. Spicer.
Chairman Schmitt and Cornyn, members of the committee, thank you for having me. I was asked to share my experience as a senior White House staffer with respect to the interactions that I and other senior staff had with President Trump during his first term. During my tenure as press secretary, I interacted with the president multiple times every day. Most days I would talk to him by phone or in person early in the morning and then multiple times throughout the day, including weekends. For the most senior positions in the White House, those designated by the rank of assistant to the president, which includes the White House chief of staff, the White House counsel, and the press secretary, it is critical to have regular interaction with the president. The position of press secretary especially demands this type of consistent and intentional communication. I or any other press secretary, regardless of administration, could not do the job effectively without regular communication with the president. It was my responsibility to have the most up-to-date understanding of President Trump's position on policy, personnel, and everything in between. Admittedly, I made a couple of rather high-profile mistakes during my tenure. You may have read some of them. But in all cases, those mistakes occurred when I wasn't connected with the president's thinking or position on a particular issue or policy. Coordinating and collaborating among even the most senior staff cannot replace direct communication with the president himself. In my position, I was very well acquainted with the president's work, his day-to-day responsibilities, and his fitness for office. I watched him serve with the strength and endurance of a man half his age. As you can see on almost a daily basis through events, statements, and social media posts, he's up early and ends his days very late. Yet in several instances during his first term, the media questioned his fitness for office. Guests and so-called experts like Sanjay Gupta at CNN were called upon to speculate on the result of Trump's physical and mental well-being. The Washington Post ran hit pieces with headlines like, "The White House struggles to silence talk of Trump's mental fitness." Vox wrote, "Is Trump mentally unfit to be president?" NBC ran a story by the Associated Press that raised mental health concerns regarding the president. CNN's Brian Stelter questioned if members of the news media were, quote, tiptoeing around obvious questions about President Trump's instability. These headlines were not isolated instances. Most major news outlets ran with these ridiculous type of propaganda pieces. To use one of the media's favorite terms, these inquiries were without evidence. That brings us to the juxtaposition of how the very same media covered the Biden administration. To be blunt, the legacy media failed the American people. They failed to do their job. Many, rightly so, believe the media in this country is culpable in covering up the obvious decline of the 46th president of the United States. The scrutiny that was baselessly directed at President Trump during his first term was wholly absent from the media coverage of the Biden White House. The media lacked any sense of curiosity that would naturally stem from what the public could see with their own eyes. Even in the face of deeply concerning and public signs of President Biden's mental and physical decline, legacy media outlets were silent. Biden and his senior aides flatly dismissed the need for a cognitive test during his tenure, as had been requested of President Trump. Yet no protest was heard from the voices that were so critical of Trump. With the exception of a couple White House reporters like Fox News Channel's Peter Doocy, reporters generally refused to breach the subject at White House briefings. News outlets weren't the only ones complicit in covering up Biden's decline. Presidential staff would have or should have been interacting with Biden on a daily basis. At best, his administration was grossly negligent. At worst, Biden's staff actively concealed his fitness for office. When White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said President Biden could run circles on her, there were only two possible conclusions: that she herself was in poor health and in need of medical assistance, or that she was lying. There is no question that a vast difference between how President Trump interacted with his staff and how President Biden did. Whether one supports President Trump or not, he is clearly the most accessible and transparent president in modern history. And there is no question who is running this country. The same cannot be said of President Biden. It is the president who is elected by the American people. The role of staff is to execute his agenda and policies. I thank the committee for holding this hearing so that going forward, the American people can have the confidence in who is running the country and making critical decisions. The American people deserve no less.
Thank you for those opening statements. The minority did not call any witnesses for today's hearing. They have chosen to ignore the hearing as they chose to ignore President Biden's mental decline, but we do have a short video of some previous statements from Biden administration officials and Democratic Party officials telling us not to believe our lying eyes. We can play the video.
Does the president have the stamina, physically and mentally, do you think, to continue on even after 2024?
Don, you're asking me this question. Oh my gosh, he's the president of the United States. You know, I can't even keep up with him.
The most difficult part about a meeting with President Biden is preparing for it, because he is sharp, intensely probing, and detail-oriented and focused.
I can testify because I've been working very closely with this president for the past 2 years. I've been knowing him for 30 years. And I'm telling you, this guy's tough. He's smart. He's on his game.
Joe Biden has vision. He has knowledge. He has a strategic thinker.
The president is focused. He's detail-oriented. He's always thinking about the big picture.
He is engaging. He is capable. He has an incredible record as president.
And I'm often with him on foreign trips. He's at the top of his game.
So he has a vision, he has knowledge, he has judgment, he has a strategic thinking.
I met with the president, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks ago, and he seemed fine to me.
I have complete confidence in the president. I have watched him expertly guide meetings of staff and cabinet members. I could not have more confidence in the president.
I would just tell you that I meet frequently with the president, and every single time I meet with him, he is just fine.
But he is, again, knowledgeable, wise.
Incredibly sharp, incredibly probing, incredible command of the details.
He is sharp. He is on top of things.
There is nothing to these challenges, these suggestions that somehow he's not sharp and he's not capable.
We see Joe Biden up close. We know how attuned he is to the issue.
And you're going to see how smart he is and the experience he has.
I say his age is an asset.
Aha!
He's wise.
Yes, he's wise. He has wisdom. He has experience.
And his experience, because of his age and his wisdom, has been invaluable to this country.
A lot of countries, people who've been in office a longer period of time are praised for their wisdom.
I have seen a lot of 72-year-olds not as capable as this 80-year-old.
It is hard for us to keep up with this president.
His mental acuity is great. It's fine. It's as good as it's been over the years. He's fine. All this right-wing propaganda that his mental acuity has declined is wrong.
And this kind of sense that he's not ready for this job is just a bucket of BS that's so deep, your boots will get stuck in it.
Okay. Professor Harrison, I do want to ask a couple questions. I just wanted to presume for a moment that, that a pardon was issued under President Biden's auto pen signature, but issued without his direction. It comes to light that that he actually didn't direct it. A member of his staff used the auto pen for a pardon. What recourse is available under those circumstances?
Well, Senator, I think there would be two questions. The first has to do with whether, and I can't answer it other than to identify the question, which is to say sometimes documents that are properly authenticated are treated as having been validly issued even when they're not. That can happen. There are legal rules that produce that result, and I don't think there is such a rule about a pardon, but I would have to inquire into that again because there are such rules. The other thing I'd say is that for a pardon particularly, the only situation I can think of that clearly would bring into question whether the pardon was valid, which was the first question, was if the government sought to prosecute someone and the person who purportedly received the pardon offered the pardon as a defense, then the government might say that no, the pardon was invalid and therefore you weren't pardoned, you're still subject to prosecution. There might be some other way for a question like that about a pardon to come up. I can't think of another, but that's the one I can think of.
So from your perspective, let's just say that if there isn't any other legal recourse other than the one that you sort of brought up, what advice would you give to this committee or this Congress or this Senate to address that? What remedies could the legislative branch enact?
It's hard to think of anything Congress can do ex post. That's why I do think that it would be advisable ex ante to improve the process of authentication and make it more clear that documents that are signed by AutoPen really do reflect a decision by the president. That done in advance will make whatever the authentication system is more reliable.
Mr. Wald, given sort of the role that you played in trying to provide more transparency of what happened during the 4 years under Joe Biden, who was running the country under Joe Biden? Let's just take the last 2 years.
It's a great question, Senator, and at some level, I'm not the right witness for this hearing. I mean, there should be members of the media here, maybe some of your Senate colleagues who had known the president over the years and obviously had close proximity during the time of his administration, and obviously his staff. I think, sort of align with your previous question, there is a real consideration here on authentication. And in my time in the first Trump White House, there was an exhaustive process to determine how paper flowed into the Oval and when the president had given his assent to a certain action. That was through, in fact, 2 different policy channels, the staff secretary, and then there was also an office, essentially of policy management, guiding the flow of documentation. If the Biden administration staffers and personnel wanted to put this to bed, they could very easily dispel all of this by saying, here are the documents that show the president assented to these actions. The Trump administration would have that. Previous administrations would have that. And if that's not there, then there is cause to improve the way that executive branch employees authenticate actions undertaken by the president.
Yeah, I mean, the president actually performing the functions of president is kind of an important thing in our constitutional order. You had, kings used to affix their seal to show that this was an official declaration from the sovereign. In this country, the sovereign are the people. They delegate, the authority to their elected representatives. And as you mentioned in your opening statement, there's only one person elected by everybody. So that signature, this is not just a small point, that signature issuing a pardon for someone who'd been convicted of a crime, or in the case of Joe Biden, these preemptive pardons, which are sort of unprecedented, is a big deal. And I think that's part of the reason why we're here today. Mr. Spicer, I wanted to ask you, you alluded to this, but the media, so desperate to make sure President Trump never got back into office. Of course, you saw the lawfare that took place, but then, of course, this narrative that Joe Biden was fine, don't believe your lying eyes, until that they couldn't deny it anymore based on the debate. Could you just kind of compare that to your experience when you were, press secretary for President Trump, to sort of the inquiries that were made daily about his mental acuity versus the inability to do that during the 4 years under Joe Biden?
Senator, in many cases, there was no inquiry. They would just run with a story, having guests on that would question his physical or mental acuity, speculate on it, bring guests on that would speculate it. We would often then push back on those kind of stories. That's in vast contrast to the lack of any kind of curiosity that existed throughout the 4 years of President Biden. And I think the difference was they would seize on the simplest thing with President Trump, whereas in President Biden's case, there was multiple issues of physical, mental confusion, him going in the wrong direction, him falling down, him misunderstanding an event or not being able to finish the sentence. That was never the case with President Trump. They were almost manufacturing instances in his case without actually trying to get to the bottom of a story or inquire within the press office to get our response. They would go with the story, then we'd push back. With Biden, my understanding from the conversations that I would have with the media is they would never ask. They just literally were basically afraid to go there.
Senator Cornyn.
Professor Harrison, it strikes me when talking about the auto pen, there are really 2 issues. One is the mechanical use of an auto pen in lieu of an actual signature by the president. But it seems to me that we're confronted with more important or more fundamental issues is, did the president know that the auto pen was being used for that purpose? And so one would be if somebody stole the auto pen and was signing pardons on behalf of the president, but what we're confronted with here is really the capacity of the president of the United States to understand what he was supposed to be doing. And just thinking about other areas of the law where capacity is important, and whenever it comes to people writing a will, let's say, for example, disposing of their property to their children and grandchildren, occasionally there arises the issue of testamentary capacity by the person disposing of their property. And generally speaking, to have testamentary capacity, that person must understand they're signing a will, they comprehend the nature and the extent of their property, they recognize their relationships with potential beneficiaries, and understand how the will disposes of their assets. So why can't we have a similar inquiry into the executive capacity, let's say, of the President of the United States to actually know what he or she is doing?
Senator, you're absolutely right that question, whether the president or somebody else who holds official power has the legal capacity to exercise it, is distinct from authentication of documents. Authentication of documents is important, but capacity is another question. With respect specifically to the president, I think the answer there is, and this may be out of the frying pan into the fire kind of answer. The answer there is Article 2 and then the 25th Amendment deal with the situation in which the president is unable to exercise his powers and duties. And I think it's a reasonable inference, although the Constitution doesn't come out and say this, that a president who is not determined to be unable through now what's the 25th Amendment process for making that determination. There's no process in Article 2 itself. The 25th Amendment added something. A president who has not been, pursuant to the 25th Amendment, determined not to be able to exercise the powers and duties of the president is presumed to have capacity to do that. I say that not on the basis of any sort of, other than practice, that's the way it's been for a couple of hundred years, but I think that is a reasonable inference from the fact that the Constitution does make a provision about what happens when the president's unable, and the 25th Amendment then provides a process to determine by which the president's unable.
Mr. Wald, following up on Professor Harrison's answer, the 25th Amendment requires actions by the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare the President incapacitated, incapable of carrying out his or her duties. But there doesn't appear to be any accountability or any remedy when they fail to act as they did in this case. Some have suggested that there may be potential crimes committed by members of the Cabinet for failing to act, basically suborning perjury, forging government documents, impersonating a federal officer, making false statements, conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of justice, wire or mail fraud. Those are all statutes, criminal statutes that are on the books. Do you think there's any application of any of those criminal statutes to the circumstances of the Biden presidency and his incapacity and the failure of those persons, only persons authorized to question that incapacity under the 25th Amendment, the failure on their part to act?
Senator, there very well could be. I mean, obviously that would be a question for a prosecutor to take up in their discretion. I will say the 25th Amendment, it's a modern contrivance, but it still is consistent with American constitutional tradition, which it assumes that officers of the United States will act virtuously and morally. And the idea that members of the Cabinet would go to the length of avoiding the Oval Office so as to abdicate their responsibility to verify the appropriateness of the president's acuity or the ability to authenticate actions taken by the president. If that's not a constitutional scandal, I mean, honestly, I don't know what would constitute such. So yeah, I mean, I think there could be the potential for crimes, but moreover, the 25th Amendment can only function in its procedural mechanisms if people are actually willing to call a spade a spade.
Senator Britt.
Thank you, and I really appreciate Senator Cornyn, Senator Schmitt calling this hearing. This is incredibly important. I mean, you look at what the administration did, you look at what the Democratic Party did, you look at what the legacy media did. It is absolutely inexcusable. It is not only dangerous, it's disgusting. And the American people deserve better. And the fact that we have none of my Democratic colleagues over here, that this entire dais is empty, that what they allowed to happen, that they are not interested in correcting it for the future is absolutely mind-blowing. And so when we're looking at what Joe Biden did while he was in office, you have a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, leaving equipment, leaving allies, changing the way the world viewed us. You look at an emboldened Russia, Iran. You look at what happened, obviously, with China and those conversations with Joe Biden. You look at millions flooding across our border. You look at a ton of unaccompanied children coming across, hundreds of thousands. You look at hundreds of thousands of Americans dead because of fentanyl poisoning. You look at record high inflation. Who was in charge? And the fact that not one Democrat colleague can show up and try to get answers to that, I hope the American people see that for exactly what it is. And so my questions to you is, how do we prevent this in the future? So we know that the 25th Amendment in the 1960s, we take a look at that. Section 4 was purposefully vague to allow for some flexibility. Clearly, it either didn't work or we have some people we need to hold accountable for not stepping up. So I want to know from you all, what do we need to do? Do you think that there need to be more guardrails when it comes to Section 4? Do you think that we need some more standards to evaluate that? And if so, what should those standards be? And Professor Harrison, I'd like to start with you.
Senator, this is the question about further implementation of the Section 4 is one that has not received a lot of attention because fortunately, the country has not needed it very often. I think that this is a situation in which Congress's power is pretty limited because the Constitution, by design, put a somewhat vague but nevertheless meaningful concept, which is ability on the part of the president
to act
and
it also means
in the hands of
faith.
Political process. That's the
yes,
last thing
and
I'll
good
say.
faith.
Yes.
And I don't think, obviously, we don't have that here. Mr. Wald, do you have any opinion on that?
Yes, Senator. So you said, should we hold folks accountable and should there be some reforms? The answer would be both, yes. Right. So, your colleague on the Democrat side who did attend, Senator Welch, said, hey, this is just kind of retrospective. We need to move on. I would strenuously disagree with that. The only ability to move forward is if there's an accounting of what was undertaken under the Biden staff, the Biden personnel, the bureaucrats, and the cabinet. And one thing I'll just say is this very issue was debated by Republicans in 1988 in the Miller Commission report at the University of Virginia. Republicans had the open and honest, transparent discussion about the end of the Reagan presidency and whether or not there were other guardrails that needed to be imposed on the 25th Amendment. Some discussions were about the inclusion of a mental health professional on the White House medical team, whether the Surgeon General should oversee the inclusion of medical reporting as part of Section 4, Clause 4 of the 25th Amendment. All I'll say is all of those things have been set aside. There has been no legitimate discussion in the years since about how to make the 25th Amendment more robust and how it could actually operate in the instance that the president lacked capacity.
Right, and do we need to more clearly define what unable means in the 25th Amendment?
Oh, I think most certainly, and I think there should be, the other issue, and a number of legal academics, former colleagues of Professor Harrison, have taken this up over the years. Professor Calabresi wrote about this 20 years ago, that there needs to be a more precise definition. And there are lots of issues related to succession.
There clearly does, because, even from all of us from the outside, we're saying there is a problem. And the fact that we could get no one on the inside to actually take a look at what they already knew to exist and then be able to hold them accountable, we have to have other guardrails moving forward. And that is absolute. So we need to be talking today about what those guardrails are. I have a question. I'm running out of time. It's two things. One, senior staff. So I have been a senior staff member. You take an oath when you get to come and work in this body. You want to make sure you're doing what's best for the United States of America, for the state you serve, all of the things. Is there any way to hold senior staff accountable for either helping to cover up and or moving people to the side? Because it is clear that there are people within this administration that saw that, and they should be sitting in front of us today answering the question of why they turned their back on America, because that's exactly what they did. And so whether it's secretaries, whether it's people in the administration, or whether it is senior staff, we deserve some accountability and we deserve some answers. And then my last question will be for Mr. Spicer, legacy media. How in the world do we hold them accountable? If all of us on the outside can see it and we are saying, get to the bottom of this, but yet they refuse, what mechanisms should we put in place to be able to hold them accountable for not actually following what is clearly in front of them?
Senator, you're asking the right question. When it comes to accountability, it can't be overstated. When the Biden White House stripped 440 White House hard passes from independent journalists, they were attempting to control the narrative, to make sure that no one who wanted to hold them accountable was silenced. Part of what I think this administration has done so well is bringing in new voices, people from disparate backgrounds of all sorts, to ask the White House press secretary, to ask the senior staff, and to be able to hold them accountable. Part of it is allowing other voices in the media. We've seen what the legacy media did, but that's why I think the growth of independent media is so healthy for our democracy, and we need more of it, not less.
Thank you. And then the senior staff question, please.
Yeah, look, Senator, I mean, senior staff from the first Trump administration were brought in before committees and investigated for their participation in drafting the president's remarks on January 6th, for drafting a speech. So if there was an effort by senior staff, the Politburo, as they seem to like to have called themselves, if they were purposely distancing cabinet members, evading difficult Q&A with press, all as an attempt to conceal the president's mental acuity, yes, they should be held accountable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Moody.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn, Senator Schmitt. Appreciate you holding this important hearing. And certainly I appreciated my colleague, Senator Britt's remarks in listing out so many of the failures of the last administration as they played out. I think Americans, yes, sat horrified as they watched these events unfold, but at the core of those failures were bad policy decisions. And the truth is, you know, people talk a lot about the end of the Biden administration and his debate performance. But those of us that were involved of the repercussion and the consequences of some really bad, irresponsible, reckless, I would say dangerous policies, and we're involved from day one of the Biden administration, we started questioning immediately who was making these decisions because they were so disastrous for the security of this nation and the safety of our people. So I would say from day one of the presidency through all 4 years, this was a legitimate question, and every single failure that Senator Britt listed was the consequence of a policy decision. When I was the Florida Attorney General, one of the very first executive actions that came out undid both Republican and Democrat presidential precedents of saying, if someone is here in our country and they're here illegally and they are committing serious felonies, we are deporting them. And actual priorities were that those were the ones they went after first. And one of the very first actions that came out of that White House was they abandoned that both Democrats and Republican presidents had enforced and released to all law enforcement around the nation that they were no longer going to make that a priority. When sheriffs were calling and pleading with us to take these people from their jails and not make them release them back into the communities, we would try and communicate this, but indeed they were canceling detainers and releasing these people into the communities. They were taking people that were brought here from other countries, brought here only to prosecute because they were a danger to our nation and our people. And instead of deporting them after their prison sentences, they were pushing them into the United States. And I don't think it should be lost on anyone that just yesterday it came out. You know how many the Trump administration pushed into our interior in the last 4 months? Full month? 0. And I want you to compare that to a month of the Biden administration where hundreds of thousands of people, barely vetted, if vetted, were forced into our nation's interior. And you've seen these consequences play out. It's not just rape victims, murder victims, robbery victims. We've caught people here that's from foreign nations that are on the terrorist watch list that can cause some of our nation's biggest tragedies and devastation. That is the undermining of what a commander-in-chief is supposed to do in those policies. We saw it day one, and that's just one example. And it played out for 4 years. So I think one of the reasons that you see not one Democrat in this hearing room right now asking these questions is because how do you defend the indefensible? What are they going to say? I mean, there has never been a more reckless, negligent administration that I can remember in my lifetime. And as an attorney general, as the wife of a law enforcement officer, as a federal prosecutor, as a judge, I sat horrified that that was the person that was in charge of our safety, our commander-in-chief in charge of our borders. And I know, Mr. Wald, you have talked about the danger in executive actions being pushed out when somebody's not in charge that understands how it's affecting the safety of this nation. I'm sure based on your prior experience and some of the things that you saw being pushed out, I often thought, this is a radical aide's dream. You have a commander-in-chief probably not able to pay attention, and they're pushing out policies left and right. Tell me in your experience if you noticed anything where that could be the case coming out of that administration.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I mean, I think on the immigration score itself, so many of those sort of special powers exercised by President Biden on parole, on temporary protected status, they require the president to do those in his own name, correct? It's a case-by-case evaluation performed by the chief executive. And so I think in reviewing some of those, when I was sitting on the sidelines, the question I had was, what does the paper process look like for that? How did DHS work that up? How did it go through the staff secretary's office? And what was the president briefed on as far as the policy considerations tied to some of these decisions to bring in violent criminals from Haiti or Nicaragua into the interior of the United States?
And did it concern you when you learned, and we are now uncovering, that cabinet officials were kept from meeting with the president for months at a time?
Look, I mean, if you go back through our history, Senator, so Grover Cleveland, Wilson, FDR, JFK, President Johnson, President Biden, it's almost a Democrat sport to keep from the American people the health and acuity of the chief executive. They've been doing this for a long time, but this is of another level, especially as Mr. Spicer was mentioning, the complicity of the national media in obscuring this, but also that cabinet officers would go to the lengths of avoiding interacting with the chief executive because they were fearful that they would have to speak to his diminished capacity.
And I'm running out of time, and it was of particular concern that the media seemed to never ask him about executive actions and policy. Favorite flavor of ice cream, yes. Why he was pushing dangerous criminals into the interior of this nation, no. And that is why I think this hearing was so very important. What was coming out of this administration was a radical wish list, and certainly you can see it, what has happened to the consequences playing out right now, and now I think we're all seeing why.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so pleased. I join my colleague from Florida in saying it is time that we have this hearing. All across Tennessee, I hear from people every single week that say, what was really going on in the White House, and why would no one say anything when, with your very own eyes, you could look at any of the footage and see what was transpiring with President Biden. And I think the fact that many of his own cabinet members knew that he was not fit to serve and that there was a cabal behind the curtain who was making all the decisions. It is so offensive to the American people. And it's not something that is a partisan issue. As I talk with Democrats, many of them have lost faith in what they thought was going to be a very moderate Joe Biden administration, and it turned into be the far left Bernie Sanders version of the Democrat Party that was using the auto pen and making decisions and committing our great nation to policies that the American people did not support and would never have supported. And I fully believe that because of that overreach and that flippant attitude that much of his staff had toward the policies of this nation, to people in the administration that chuckled about tossing gold bars off the Titanic. They knew they were going down. They knew they were going to be found out. And they probably knew at some point there would be a hearing like today, and the other side of the dais would be completely empty because no one can defend what they did. Mr. Wald, I want to come to you for a moment. and talk about something that was really a disturbing revelation from the Tapper Thompson book. And you know, this is part of the thing. Now we're finding out the media was all a part of the joke. They were part of the ruse. They were part of the fraud that was pushed forward. A Biden staffer told the authors that Biden just had to win and then he could disappear for 4 years. That's all they needed to do. And, you know, the following statement was he'd only have to show proof of life every once in a while. And as I had a Tennessean say to me, when they had actually downloaded this book and read it, and then they said, you know, how stupid do they think we are? And the disrespect this administration showed to the American people. Why is it that the American people appreciate that President Trump goes out and nearly every day is taking questions and answering questions? Is because they have now found out that these staffers were willing to do undemocratic things, as using their term, to keep the president in office, to keep Biden there. They were willing to do undemocratic things, unlawful things. So, Mr. Wald, let's talk about that behavior and how that undermines the faith of Tennesseans and all Americans in our public institutions, because they could see what was happening, but they were being lied to by people in the White House who were probably then running in their office and saying, well, we pulled it off another day.
Yeah, Senator, I mean, this is a theme you've talked about for many years, which is the executive branch is enormous. I mean, there are close to 1,000 employees in the executive office of the president. There are nearly 4 million full-time federal employees throughout the 14 departments that the president oversees. Executive power as accountable to the people of this country really manifests in two ways. The power of the president to remove bureaucrats and to fire them, and to affix his signature to official actions that he undertakes. So when the Washington establishment says something to the effect of, well, democracy dies in darkness, yes, it does when there are staffers, the media, cabinet officials, senior advisors to the president who all create a covering sort of shroud of darkness that obscures who is actually making the decisions. And one other thing I'll just say very quickly, a number of your colleagues on the Democrat side have said, well, there's an OLC opinion here. We don't need to talk anymore. There's an OLC opinion. It says you can use the auto pen. The opening paragraph of that OLC opinion says you can use the auto pen, but only when the president directs that you do so under his decision-making power, right? It is very clear again and again that the president actually has to make the decision. That cannot be delegated to a staffer or an advisor. And there's no indication here that anyone other than staff were making these decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. You know, the visual, sometimes it really is true. A picture speaks louder than words. It's worth 1,000 words. And here, all you have to do is look over at this side of the dais to see that the stone wall continues. I mean, from the party that lied to this nation for 4 years, let's just take a look at some of the things that our colleagues said on the Democrat side when their own Justice Department was concluding that Joe Biden, who, let's not forget, illegally took classified documents and kept them in his garage, in his freezer. I mean, Lord knows where. He just certainly didn't know. Their own Justice Department interviewed the guy and concluded he could not form the requisite mental state to stand trial. He did not have the mental ability to stand trial. And what did our Democrat colleagues say? Vice President Harris says, oh, no, the way that the Hur report characterized the president is so wrong. The president's demeanor is totally fine. Senator Smith, what the Hur said about the president not remembering his son's death, so unfair. Senator Kaine said this is grandstanding. Senator Fetterman said it's just cheap shots. You had other senators saying, Senator Ossoff in February of 2024, saying, and I quote, I found the president to be sharp, focused, impressive, formidable, and effective. In June 2024, Congressman Jeffries insists Biden was, and I'm quoting again, incredibly strong, forceful, and decisive. Where are they now? They don't want to answer for any of those quotes now. They lied to us for 4 years, and we know they lied. They know they lied. It's why they're not here. They don't want to answer a single question. They can't bear to show their faces in public. And you know what? It's right that they can't do that, because the bill of goods they sold this country, they walked this country right into one of the greatest constitutional crises of our history, And now they are afraid to even show up to admit it. These are people, and this is a party that cannot be trusted with power, that cannot be trusted to tell the truth, the most basic truth. They all changed their tunes after Joe Biden debated President Trump, and the whole world could see he couldn't even form a sentence, that running this guy for president again is a form of elder abuse. My, how they changed their tunes after that. Now they can't even show up in public to talk about it. This is embarrassing. But worse than that, it's dangerous. It is dangerous for this country. Mr. Wald, I want to pick up on something you just said a second ago about the OLC and their opinion as to when an auto pen can be used. Just be clear about this. Auto pen means not signed by the person. Auto pen is basically push of a button and it gets signed. OLC says only when the president specifically directs it and it is under his direct authority. Do I basically have that right?
That's correct, Senator.
So, based on the facts we know, did that happen in this case with all of the pardons and clemencies and other giveaways that Joe Biden signed?
Assuming that the Biden White House complied with sort of traditional practice of presidential administrations and that there was record keeping either from the staff secretary or others, there should be records to indicate either through covering memorandum or briefing books where the president would have signed his signature authorizing this decision. None of that has come forward. That would be very easy to dispel some of these concerns. And I think what we're seeing here is really the auto pen is best understood as sort of a tool of executive convenience.
Hold on just a second. You just said something very important. I want to emphasize that. So what you're saying is that there should be, for every time that Biden authorized the auto pen, there should be a record of that. And he should have had to have registered his personal consent to using the auto pen. Is that basically correct?
I think to put it another way, I would say in the policy paper flow to the Oval Office, there should be a record of what documents are presented to the president when he gave his assent to the actions that are listed in those documents, whether it's a judicial nomination or it's a statutory response to Congress.
Well, I think the answer is we need to get those documents. And I just say to our friends in the media over here, you guys need to be asking for those documents, and we need to be asking for them, Mr. Chairman. We need to see those documents. And the president, the former president now, can certainly choose to release them. I'm sure they're part of his personal papers, right, Mr. Wald?
And that's correct. And the first place to start would be the staff secretary's office under President Biden.
Oh, so here's the trail. If you want to know, if you want an answer to the question, did Joe Biden actually assent to the use of the auto pen, and you think of all the people he pardoned, he granted clemency to, murderers, drug dealers, child rapists. Let's find out, did he actually authorize it? There should be a record of it, is what we've learned today. Thank you for that testimony, Mr. Wald. There should be a record of it. So this is a binary question. It's not, oh, we don't know, gee, it's hard to say. No, actually, we can find out. So right now, today, I call on President Biden, former President Biden and his staff, release the documents. You have them, you know you have them, release them. If what you did is legal, and if you're really not embarrassed about it, and you think it was totally constitutional, release the paper flow. Show us the documents where the president authorized the use of the pen for every single pardon and clemency and stay application. Let's see it. Let's see all of it. And if you won't do it, we should subpoena those documents, and we should find out the truth of who was really running the White House, because I think we can see it was not Joe Biden. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Wald, thanks for your testimony.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to try to separate policy and politics for a second. I know it's hard to do around this place, but I thought Senator Cornyn made a very good point in his opening remarks. I think Senator Schmitt made the same point that the policy here is very important. And I want to ask you your opinion on the policy. Professor, tell me briefly I know you came to talk about auto pens, but tell me briefly about the 25th Amendment.
Well, Senator, the 25th Amendment provides the process by which to implement a principle that's in the original Constitution, which is when the president's unable to exercise the powers and duties of the presidency, somebody else exercises them, starting with the vice president. The 25th Amendment sets up a process by which, if there's a question whether the president is able to do that, the vice president and the heads of the executive departments can temporarily basically put the vice president in as acting president, and then Congress ultimately decides the question.
Well, the standard, is it not, Professor? The standard is disability of the president. Is that correct?
Unable to exercise the powers and duties.
Okay.
Yes.
Here's what I would like your opinion on, and the opinion of these two gentlemen here. You have all been staffers. You've worked in government. You've had a boss. In Mr. Spicer's case, his boss was the President of the United States. Let's suppose the President, you were using your experience as a staffer. You were working for the President, any President, hypothetically a President. And let's suppose the President started talking like he was from outer space. Let's suppose the President became fatigued very easily. He couldn't finish a sentence without taking a nap. Let's suppose the President, he was just physically in bad shape, mentally and physically. Mentally, he may or may not have, you're not a doctor, neurodegenerative disease, but physically you can see you could bake a Thanksgiving turkey in the time it takes him to walk across the stage. What is, do you think, as a member of his staff, what do you think is your moral obligation to say, wait a minute, the president can't do the job anymore? I know you're loyal folks. You believe in your president, this president, whichever president. I'm speaking hypothetically. You're loyal. You want to be a good staffer, but you also have a moral obligation. How do you reach that decision, Professor? And I'll go to each of you.
Senator, I think the first thing you would have to do in a situation like that is exercise your own judgment. How serious is this problem? Because everybody has moments when they lose focus, it happens. But if somebody thinks this is a really serious problem, I think the first thing to do is the most difficult, which is to say to the president, because the 25th Amendment also provides that the president can say, I'm unable to exercise the powers and duties of my office.
And suppose the president
That would be extremely
says,
difficult, but I think it should be done.
Look, trust me, I can. And it's clear to you that he has neurodegenerative disease and he can't. What do? Do you have a moral obligation as a staff member to go to the American people and say, we've got a problem here, it may cost me my career?
Senator, I think at that point you have an obligation to talk to the vice president, who is in charge of the Section 4 process under the 25th Amendment.
What about you, Mr. Wald? Do you have a moral obligation? I understand you want it to go away, you want to work it out with him, but you can't. When does a staffer have a moral obligation to stand up and say he can't be president anymore, or she can't be?
Well, Senator, the 25th Amendment only works if individual staffers or officers of the United States exercise that kind of moral judgment.
That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think always, as the professor said, the presidency is an enormous burden, so it would be not one instance, it would have to be several instances of a failure to exercise judgment.
How do you make that decision? You're the staffer, I get it.
Yeah, well, I think it begins with prayer, of course, but after that, I think it's conversation with other staffers, and if you're unable to confront the president or to raise the issue with the vice president, you should resign.
What about you, Mr. Spicer? Do you stand up and do it and tell the truth and run, or do you have a greater obligation to your boss?
Well, luckily I didn't have that problem. But I would say that you have a moral obligation as an American, as a citizen, as a human being. If the leader of the free world cannot conduct themselves to make the decisions that are critical to this country and to the world, you absolutely have a moral obligation to follow the chain of command. And if they don't act, then you must.
Do either of you gentlemen disagree with that? Professor?
Senator, I think acting means talking to the people who have the responsibility or in a position under the Constitution to do something.
You don't
about the
agree with
situation.
Mr. Spicer?
Senator, I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind, other than talking about talking to the people who can make the decision.
I'm just trying to ask, you've all been staffers. Suppose you go to everybody you're supposed to go to, and they all say, my advice to you is to shut up. Do you have a moral obligation as a staffer to say, look, this person can't be president of the United States. It isn't policy. He physically can't do it.
Senator Kennedy, it's not a question of whether a staffer has that obligation. It's whether you as an American have that obligation, and I think each and every one of us does.
Yeah, but you can see it. An American can't. Professor, what do you think?
Senator, I think there are situations under which someone in that position should speak publicly, but I also think that the views of a single individual who is not the person who is constitutionally responsible for taking measures should be considered by the public as just the views of of one individual who has some information about the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Actually, the fact that this is in the past kind of reminds me of that scene in Lion King where Rafiki, the andro, hit Simba on the head and said, doesn't matter, it's in the past. I hear, I could see where my Democrat colleagues would like to use that argument, but it mattered. And for me, I met President Biden as Vice President Biden when I was sworn in. He literally sworn me in 2015, and I've had several interactions with him over the years. There's no question that there was a significant degradation in his cognitive abilities. Probably the last time I spent much time with him was at a NATO summit. And I do think there are a lot of legitimate questions to be asked about who may have been tending the store, and I believe we should get to the bottom of it. But I want to look to the future. And back when this discussion was going on, I was suggesting the 25th Amendment. We know what the 25th Amendment does. Professor, I'm kind of curious about why, and with due respect to my colleague from Louisiana, this is a hell of a burden to place on a staff. Mr. Spicer, you've been in the White House. Can you imagine how heavy that would be and how unlikely it would be for you to be successful as an individual staff member? But Professor Harrison, I'm thinking more along the lines of what you see in boardrooms all the time about annual evaluations of the CEO or board members. What about the concept of something short of triggering the 25th Amendment, where the cabinet members, hand-selected members of the president, confirmed by the Senate, maybe on an annual basis, have to have an attestation that based on their work with the President of the United States, that he is mentally capable, fit, and the same way that we have boards make those decisions about board directors and CEOs. What would be wrong with some sort of a report or attestation to Congress from the cabinet member saying this man or woman is good to go, and it would be it would be perjury to Congress if they ended up covering up and history proved that. What's wrong with something like that as we're looking forward?
Senator, I would be, and maybe I am sort of being unduly protective of the independence of the other two branches, but
well, that's sort of why I want to leave it in the. That's why all I want is the cabinet to truthfully attest to the fact that their boss is of sound mind and body, and unless they lie, it's not an issue.
Senator,
it's an Article 2 responsibility to report to Congress like so many other things. What's wrong with that?
I think it would be a very good idea for the president to create a process like that. My concern is the thought of Congress making such a process mandatory, especially in light.
Well, I'm trying to figure out the consequence, because arguably, I find it hard to believe that there were members of the cabinet that didn't go, you know what, we love this guy, he appointed us to this position, but he's missing a step. And they're refusing to, this is not about any one person. This country, this is about 340 million people in this country. No one of us should think that we should somehow be given a break if we're missing a step. So all I'm saying is you got to report honestly to Congress that the President of the United States, in your opinion, is absolutely demonstrated sound mind and body. It's just, it's like no other testimony. It'd be no different than us having them before the committee and say, is the boss okay? And if they lied, they'd be perjuring themselves. So what's the difference between that and some sort of a pro forma report that I'd be willing to subject the current president to, and then we'd have it for all the future presidents? What would be wrong with that?
Senator, again, I think the problem there is the Constitution has created a process for that, and that's the 25th Amendment, and that suggests that Congress can't create another process. Now, I do think that the point you're making today is part of the political process that might lead presidents to create a system like that on their own, which might enhance the people's confidence.
About to run out of time. Mr. Spicer, what do you think?
Senator, the president normally goes under a routine physical every year. In the case of President Biden, it was Dr. O'Connor who affirmatively stated his fitness for office. The doctor is probably the most competent person to attest to the president's fitness for office. The doctor should be held accountable for stating in the affirmative that President Biden was fit for office.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Biden administration may go down in history as the most brazen constitutional fraud in American history. A Potemkin presidency fronted by a failing puppet with staffers behind the scenes pulling the strings. This is not political hyperbole. The American people saw it with their own eyes during the June 2024 debate. Numerous times, Biden stood frozen behind the podium, mouth agape, eyes frozen and unblinking. When he did speak, his words were confused and disjointed. I said that night, this is the most consequential presidential debate in history because it will result in one of the two candidates being removed from the ballot. That was exactly right. And following that debate, the Democrats recognized the collapse. They pulled out their knives and took out President Biden like Caesar on the Ides of March. For all of their strutting about, protesting that they support democracy, not a one of them gave a damn about democracy when they pulled Biden off the ballot and dropped Kamala Harris in without a single Democrat primary voter voting for him. And you know what? Not a single Democrat is here today because not a single one of them gives a damn about the fact that they lied to the American people for 4 years. They knew. Every one of them knew that Joe Biden was mentally not competent to do the job. The White House press secretary, she knew when she stood in front of the American people and lied over and over and over again. And they're not here because they can't defend themselves. It wasn't a surprise. For 4 years, the White House hid President Biden from Republican senators, would not let him meet with us. He served 40 years in this body. We all know him. And they deliberately lied. And by the way, Jake Tapper had a bombshell book exposing the incredible scandal that Biden's mental decline was covered up by Jake Tapper. There's a Yiddish word, chutzpah. And that truly is chutzpah. How dare we lie and cover up what we all knew? Now, I have been asked literally 1,000 times by Texans, who was running the country? And I'm going to give you the most terrifying answer. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And not a single Democrat here cares. The most telling proof of Biden's decline came with the signature of the president, the symbol of executive authority that was outsourced to a machine. Mr. Wald, you're a lawyer who served in the White House counsel's office. You understand the gravity of presidential action. Does the president's signature carry legal and constitutional weight under Article 2?
Yes.
Is the act of signing an executive order or signing a law or granting a pardon a delegable duty of the president?
So in that opinion in 2005 from OLC, they said essentially that an auto pen could be used by a subordinate, but the president's determination as to sign the document can never be delegated.
Can that authority be transferred to a staffer or a machine without the president's explicit authorization?
Never.
And if you look at the statistics are stunning. In 2021, President Biden issued 78 executive orders. None were signed with an auto pen. That first year of the presidency, Biden, I suppose, was relatively lucid, and 78 executive orders he signed by hand. The second year, however, we see the auto pen emerge. The first auto pen executive order was issued on July 15th, 2022. After that day, 100% of the executive orders issued in 2022 were signed by an auto pen. In 2023, Biden issued 24 executive orders. 16 were auto penned. In 2024, Biden issued 19. 14 were auto penned. In 2025, Biden issued 14 executive orders. Every single one was auto penned. Mr. Wald, let me ask you as a legal matter, if there's a law that's passed both houses of Congress and it goes to the White House, and a staffer auto pens signing that law without the president's authorization, is that law legally passed and signed into law?
No.
If an executive order is issued and a staffer auto pens it without the president's authorization, is that executive order legally binding?
No.
And if a pardon is issued from the President of the United States and a staffer auto pens it without the president's authorization, is that pardon legally binding?
No.
Under the Biden White House, the ceremonial song, Hail to the Chief, was effectively replaced with Hail to the Pen. And it was an outright assault on democracy. And every reporter covering this ought to ask, why doesn't a Democrat care? We heard about the moral responsibilities of a staffer. How about an elected senator who knows damn well that if we get into a war and Iran is preparing to fire a nuclear weapon at the United States, that the commander-in-chief is busy playing with his Jell-O and is not competent to defend ourselves? And every member of the cabinet, the chief of staff, the press secretary, and the members of Congress who lied about this on a daily basis with the press's complicity, they are all responsible for subverting democracy.
Senator Cornyn.
Professor Harrison, we've talked about the mechanics of the 25th Amendment whereby an incapacitated president would be removed. But it strikes me that ultimately it happened, albeit not before the end of President Biden's full term. What we saw happen after the disastrous debate in the summer of 2024 is basically an exercise of the powers of the 25th Amendment by the political elites in the Democratic Party to get President Biden not to run again and to substitute Kamala Harris for him as the Democratic nominee for president. So, Mr. Spicer, maybe the mechanics were a little bit different. Maybe the timing was not the same, but doesn't that demonstrate the capacity of the leadership of the Democratic Party, of the Biden family, of the senior staff and the president's administration to be able to convince the president that he no longer was capable of serving and needed to step down?
Senator, the left and their friends in the media like to throw around terms like threats to democracy, constitutional crisis. And if we don't have confidence in the leader of the free world making decisions, that truly is the definition of a constitutional crisis and the threat to democracy. So for all of these folks to stand up here and use those phrases over and over again and then not have the desire to show up, to understand what's happening, to stand up at the time, as we discussed earlier, whether it was a staffer or a cabinet member, to literally avoid going to the Oval Office, and in the case of the media, to avoid the questions that were so clearly obvious to the rest of America, shows that they were more concerned with power and preserving that power and an agenda than they were at really caring about the Constitution and democracy.
I agree that that is the clear conclusion. And obviously they decided to do it only at such a time as that ability to wield power was coming to an end. If, in fact, President Biden had remained the nominee of the Democratic Party and then ran against and lost to President Trump, these folks would be out of luck and out of power. So they decided to act under that circumstance.
Senator, you look at a lot of these decisions, and it was pretty clear that there was a handful of folks at the top of the Biden administration and Biden White House that had been around him for decades, where all of that information funneled. So I mentioned before, there are approximately 25 senior White House staffers that have the rank of assistant to the president. Those are the highest White House staffers. I would bet that only a handful of them ever interacted with President Biden on a daily basis. The rest of them had their communications funneled through other people. If the press secretary, the communications director, whose job it is to speak on behalf of the principal in lieu of them being able to talk or communicate, don't have access to those individuals at the senior-most level, then what good are they? And I would argue that while many times we heard people in the press and on the left accuse the Trump White House of quote-unquote lying, for them to go out there and talk about the president's stance on issues, what President Biden thought or didn't think on a personnel issue, a policy issue, when in fact they had never spoken to him, is in fact the epitome of lying.
One of the most consequential actions or inactions of the Biden presidency during 4 years was his failures to secure our southern border and to deal with illegal immigration. I have in my hand examples of the Biden immigration proclamations and executive orders, and there are a lot of them, as you know. They also include things like granting temporary protected status to large populations of immigrants, particularly from countries in Central America, rescinding Trump administration policies when it came to enforcing our laws at the border, granting parole, which is essentially a permission slip to enter the country in a way that would otherwise be illegal. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that this document be made part of the record as an example of the sort of consequential border security and immigration-related measures that President Biden purported to sign.
Without objection. Mr. Wald, I do want to follow up on a couple of things with you and Mr. Harrison and also Mr. Spicer. Under the Presidential Powers Act, we could have a special access request, correct, to the archivist to find out what assent was actually given by Joe Biden on the auto pen. Is that your understanding?
If they kept records,
right.
Yes.
Right. Well, I think that will be something we will be pursuing. Professor Harrison, I wanted to ask you, sort of on the Article 1 branch's role, and I think I understand your concern when you say the president could do something. You're dealing with sort of a separation of powers issue is sort of what I'm reading into that. So the Article 1 branch can impeach for high crimes and misdemeanors. Should the Constitution be amended, in your view, to deal with this incapacitation? So impeachment would be a vehicle beyond just the 25th Amendment, but impeachment would be a vehicle to deal with these issues.
Senator, there's a long-standing question about whether impeachment is appropriate for inability. There's been questions right at the beginning of the Republic about a couple of judges who were in very poor shape. Not that they'd committed crimes, they were impeached and removed, and there were doubts as to whether impeachment was appropriate for that because there was their problem was age and inability. So you're absolutely right that there's a doubt right now whether the impeachment process, and it goes back a long, long way, whether the impeachment process is a way of dealing with inability as opposed to misconduct. It's clearly primarily directed at misconduct, and I think that if members of Congress are thinking about an additional constitutional amendment, and maybe they should be, they should think both about adapting the impeachment process to inability, which, as I say, right now it's not clear it's properly used in those situations, or creating yet some other political process to deal with presidential inability if lawmakers think that the political process that's in Sections 3 and 4 of the 25th Amendment is inadequate. The last thing I'll say, just as a policy matter, and this is not speaking on the legal question, I do think it's important that any decision about presidential inability remain something that's decided by politically accountable people, that it's treated as a political decision. It can't just be a technocratic decision.
Mr. Spicer, you've criticized the corporate media and legacy media folks for sort of lying down here or being complicit because of their, whether it's Trump derangement syndrome or whatever the reason was. Who specifically do you think gets a gold star for lying most profusely and just sort of continuing to cover this up over the years?
Sir, that would be like a photo finish. There'd be a lot that would probably right there at first place. They're all culpable. I mean, I read some of the headlines to the committee earlier, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, where they, without evidence, to use their phrase, went after President Trump's physical and mental acuity, and yet failed to ask similar questions of the White House press office publicly. They failed to cover the stories. I don't think that there's a winner. I think they're all losers.
Thank you. And then we'll sort of wrap up here with Professor Harrison and Mr. Wald. So moving forward, we mentioned maybe possibly amending the Constitution or further exploring whether incapacitation is an impeachable, if impeachment's a remedy. What other, in your experience, what other things moving forward could be done to make sure that this scenario that we saw play out over the last 4 years never happens again?
Senator, I think the most important thing that can be done is something you're doing right now, which is draw public attention to this problem, and so give presidents an incentive to take steps that will reassure the people that they are sound and able to perform their functions.
Mr. Wald.
I would agree with the professor and just add that there should be some accountability for the staffers and the officers of the United States who acted to conceal and to cover up the president's incapacity from the American people. One other issue that's tied up in sort of this bundle of incapacity, impeachment, is also succession, and that's something so many have written about extensively over the years. We are very blessed that we have never had a double vacancy with the president and the vice president, either because of terror attack or misconduct. That's something that legal scholars have said for many decades, that Congress really has to work on that. And I would add, yes, in fact, that's something you all should take up with some seriousness.
May I say spontaneously, yes, please.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony here today. Written questions for them may be submitted for the record until June 26th at 5 p.m. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. She doesn't have bandwidth for a couple of weeks. So
I was pushed out by the fact that she's like.
And I checked and I said, yeah. How do you see a picture when there's strictly black? How do you see
Yeah, second, that's right.
Like I followed the circle. Oh, I see. Yeah, like I was like, that's red.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's red. So I was like, wait a minute, there's a red circle right here, and then I turned around and
And it couldn't really be anything else. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I mean, I'm second that.
Yeah.
Maybe sure. It takes antibiotics for no reason. Right. It's not
Second.
ideal, obviously.
Right.
They
just have one question.
Balance of your stomach. That's nothing compared to Lyme's disease.
Oh, no, she can take that. We already coordinated. We're not going to No. Okay. Okay. No worries. Sorry, I'm coordinating already.
He gave it back and he took it again. He said he needed it himself.
So when all those
I'm just wondering. I sent them a message.
of not treating.
Yeah, I literally just saw it.
He
must have had. I know that
Saturday though.
I tried that.
To go on the line and stay in here. Look like a side.
Oh, okay. Way about outside. He doesn't have it better than me. I don't know. I don't know. What they have to do is at least let you know if. Can you?
Where have you been? I have been. Yeah, he said he needed it on Friday. He said outside.
And then the week before I was told, and now we can't go. So you guys not providing your extra?
I thought he put that.
Right, which I kind of.
Well, I was doing marathon. What? Monday and Tuesday.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm 4-minute drive from the East Coast.
So I was early calling yesterday morning.
Like the east side of the down.
That's the thing with it.
I hear the rest.
With traffic, so I don't know. So from that, like I leave like at 9
Early to LA.
an hour. It's longer, obviously, though, if you're going to like 6 rush hour. It's also though, like if I take the metro,
I had a recurrence once. Why I had a recurrence, I don't know. So I've been by
to the West Coast.
Was it a recurrence to this that
I don't know if it's in like weekends and stuff.
I don't know. All I know is that hard work and
The train ride, though, look at the train. From like
Go, Dave.
I don't think I have.
House about.
I mean, that's long-term side effects like I've heard about this happening. Severe cases. That's not the norm. You gotta wonder why that happened. But if I after that first case, get something right to know. I mean, I always
No, he's no. He's yeah. Elmo was showing us something else. Yeah, they're not.
Because that was
They make it deodorant, honestly.
Anyway, they didn't know what they were. Now they're fine. I don't know if they're fine. I mean, the point is, it's like, they recovered like from so there's very sad.
Might not have a future in politics, and that is notable right now, simply because there's a number of Republicans who have come out in the House of Representatives and the Senate saying some certain changes have been made to the bill, to the structure of the bill, to preclude them from voting in favor of it. Here's the comments that they made.
All the way down here. That's not at all. We found good. First one was yeah, it is.
Many days go by and things just we had I mean, put it this way, it's such a slow acting disease. You can't even test positive for it until a doctor this is the end.
Again, Senator Sturgis in your church, they're going to have fair language on politics, some of them are going to be an election.
I'd like to see for president
It's hard to be up. You gotta be shorter.
I know.
Even of like your dad's tattoo.
It's like, sorry, my dad's 6'6", I've got a little bit of height.
Yeah. No, it's like it's same with my dog.
Yeah, just have you know,
But he said I'll sign him that one day or 1 week. Emily and I were watching the Pentagon pizza. Yeah, it's like on Sony. Yeah, but basically, if something's going on, like with the Department of Defense, or like a lot going on in general, they track the kids places that are by the Pentagon, and if there's higher than normal activity, they're ordering boxes and doing stuff with the Pentagon. So there was like some moments of high activity yesterday. All the souls are giving their lobster. Yes.
You're going to have to change your venue.
You guys see my TikTok? All the soldiers are posting like we're gonna have lobster dinner.